Imagine a young girl in Port Arthur, Texas, born on January 19th, 1943, who feels like she doesn't belong. The stifling humidity of the Gulf Coast and the rigid expectations of a conservative southern town loom all around her, making her self-conscious about her appearance and her outspoken nature. The local school children bully her mercilessly for her acne, her weight, and her penchant for challenging social norms. She is Janis Joplin, and by the time she reaches her teenage years, she can't wait to escape the narrow mindset of her hometown. The constant teasing and name-calling, such as freak ugliest man on campus and N-lover, because she supports integration, cut deep. Feeling like an outcast, she retreats into music. She once said her experiences left her with no patience for injustice. She'd later recall that she was laughed out of class, out of town, out of the state, a phrase that captures her adolescent anguish. Yet this young woman who endures relentless cruelty in Port Arthur will soon emerge as one of the most iconic rock and blues vocalists America has ever seen. It's not a seamless trajectory. At one point, she enrolls at the University of Texas at Austin, only to drop out shortly thereafter. Fraternities on campus vote her ugliest man on campus, a cruel stunt that further demoralizes her. Feeling suffocated, she decides to leave Texas altogether, heading west to San Francisco. That single choice brings her into the swirl of the 1960s counterculture. She arrives in the Bay Area when the epicenter of a new, electrifying music scene is exploding. Folk revival, psychedelia, blues rock fusion, and the revolutionary spirit of Haight-Ashbury. Early on, she plays jangly folk tunes in coffee houses, but it's the blues that truly resonates in her heart. She becomes enthralled by the raw power of singers like Billie Holiday, Bessie Smith, and Odetta, women who channel heartbreak and oppression into transcendent musical expressions. Janis tells anyone who will listen that she wants to bring that same emotional authenticity into her own performances. "I want to be the first black-white person," she's quoted as saying, referring to her deep desire to sing the blues with the same unfiltered pain and passion as her black heroes. In San Francisco, she's eventually recruited by Chet Helms to join Big Brother and the Holding Company in 1966. She stands out from the moment she steps on stage with them. Her unrestrained wailing vocals and bohemian style signal something different, something new. Her curly hair, tinted round glasses, flamboyant clothing, and boisterous stage presence make her an icon of the emerging hippie generation. Big Brother's raw sound, combined with her volcanic voice, catches the attention of concert-goers, who immediately sense that they're witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime phenomenon. It doesn't take long for her to gain wider notice. In June 1967, Big Brother and the Holding Company perform at the Monterey International Pop Festival, a transformative moment in rock history that also catapults Jimi Hendrix and The Who to stardom. When Janis belts out Ball and Chain, her performance practically stops the world in its tracks. The audience can't believe the emotional grit coming from this Texas-born singer. Her voice tears through the air. It's raspy, soulful, and ferociously honest. For many, this is the first time they've encountered such a staggering blend of blues tradition and psychedelic rock. Janis's name begins reverberating nationwide. On stage, she starts to cultivate a personal style that will become synonymous with her name. The round, rose-tinted glasses, the swirling psychedelic outfits, and of course, the bottle of Southern Comfort whiskey she swigs between songs. Her 1964 Porsche 356, custom painted in a riot of psychedelic images, soon becomes another Janis trademark. She stands next to that colorful car in numerous photos, wearing battered boots, clunky jewelry, and exuding a carefree spirit that aligns perfectly with the rebellious late 1960s ethos. People immediately recognize that's Janis Joplin's Portia, and that's Janis Joplin's style. Part of that style, for better or worse, is the bottle of Southern comfort that never seems far from her grasp. During shows, she carries it casually, taking gulps as though it were water. A Rolling Stone writer named David Dalton spends time with her in 1970 and observes the chaotic contents of her oversized purse, an antique cigarette holder, a few motel keys, tapes of Johnny Cash and Otis Redding, and, inevitably, an empty bottle of Southern Comfort. Dalton notes that she seems obsessed with the whiskey. It helps her relax when she's about to unleash the emotional torrent of the blues. The brand itself, evidently delighted at her free publicity, rewards her enthusiasm by sending her a lynx fur coat and matching hat, an extravagant gift that in modern times would generate fierce protests, but in the late 1960s feels like nothing more than a quirky testament to Joplin's star power. That gift underscores how swiftly her fame grows, but it also hints at her vulnerability. Janis uses Southern comfort to steady her nerves, to quell the insecurities that have haunted her since childhood, and to fuel her unbridled high-energy stage performances. Unfortunately, her struggle with addiction extends beyond alcohol. By the mid-1960s, she is using heroin in alarming quantities. Reports circulate that by 1969, her habit costs roughly $200 a day, an astronomical sum at the time, equivalent to hundreds more in today's money. It isn't long before her friends stage an intervention, urging her to detox and reclaim her life. She does quit for a while, but the grip of addiction is merciless. Relapses lurk around every corner of her frenzied existence. Despite the darkness that shadows her personal life, her professional achievements continue to mount. After Big Brother and the holding company released the album Cheap Thrills in 1968, including hits like Piece of My Heart, the group becomes a powerhouse in psychedelic blues rock. But success intensifies tensions, and Janis departs the band that same year to form the Cosmic Blues Band. She's determined to explore a new sound, incorporating horns and a more R&B-driven groove. Her drive to evolve matches her restless spirit. Although critics are divided, audiences remain entranced by her presence. In 1969, she performs at Woodstock, another legendary festival that cements her place in rock history. However, logistical mayhem and her own escalating substance use hamper her performance. By the time she finally steps onto the Woodstock stage, she's under the influence of heroin and possibly alcohol. Many close friends later recount that this was not her best show. Still, fans love her, and she soldiers on, passionately belting out her songs. She continues touring, recording, and making occasional public appearances, though her lifestyle remains as frenetic as ever. That year, she also crosses paths with Jim Morrison of The Doors, arguably another larger-than-life rock persona of the era. A friend, music producer Paul Rothchild, decides to introduce these two charismatic forces at a party in Hidden Hills. At first, they hit it off. Janis thinks Morrison is intriguing, and Jim is fascinated by her raw magnetism. But Morrison's reputation for drunken, belligerent behavior rears its head. As the night wears on, he becomes sloppy, trying to seduce Janis. Instead of being charmed, she grows irritated. When she finally tries to leave with Rothschild, Morrison follows, grabbing her by the hair in an aggressive, caveman-like attempt to keep her from leaving. Infuriated, Janis slams her bottle of Southern Comfort onto Morrison's head, knocking him out cold. The story is recounted in numerous anecdotes. The Lizard King meets his match in Janis Joplin, who is neither intimidated by nor tolerant of abusive behavior. Morrison isn't the only 1960s rock figure who tangles with the law in Florida. He famously faces charges for allegedly exposing himself on stage in Miami. Janis has her own confrontation with conservative Floridian authorities. During a show at the Curtis Hickson Hall, local police turn on the house lights mid-performance to calm the rowdy audience. They ask her to help by telling the crowd to quiet down. Janis, fiercely protective of her fans and outraged by what she sees as unnecessary interference, instead shouts profanities at the officers. Though the concert continues without further interruption, she's arrested afterward in her dressing room and spends a night in jail for obscenity. Ultimately, a judge rules that she was simply exercising her freedom of speech, and the charges are dropped. Yet this incident underscores the culture clash at the time. Mainstream America, with its conservative codes, is ill-prepared for the flamboyant, uninhibited power of Janis Joplin. She carries that same headstrong attitude into her personal relationships. Leonard Cohen once bumps into her at the Chelsea Hotel elevator in 1968. She's apparently searching for Chris Christopherson, someone she has a burning interest in at the time, and Cohen jokes that he himself is Christopherson. They end up spending a night together, an encounter that Cohen will later immortalize in his song Chelsea Hotel No. 2. For Janis, the fling is a moment of heartbreak because, by her own admission, she wasn't actually looking for Cohen. He likewise had his heart set on someone else, Brigitte Bardot, and ended up with Janis through a whimsical twist of fate. The two parted amicably, though Janis felt hurt, her insecurities once again surfacing. She's used to heartbreak. Her love life is often a roller coaster of intense highs and devastating lows. She says openly that she might go bawling with strangers one day and nurse her wounds the next. Yet those vulnerabilities remain raw. Part of her legend is how she channels every iota of pain into her music, turning heartbreak into a soulful wail that resonates with thousands of fans who identify with her sense of alienation. In 1970, she begins working with the Full Tilt Boogie Band, feeling newly energized. She immerses herself in creating her next album, Pearl, which becomes a labor of love. This period also sees her flirting with living a slightly healthier lifestyle, at least compared to her earlier harrowing drug use. She openly discusses how focusing on recording helps her cut back on heroin. But the grip of addiction proves persistent. The year 1970 is also tragic for another legendary figure, Jimi Hendrix. He dies on September 18th, just 16 days before Janis's own death, on October 4th. Both are 27 years old, forever linking them in that now infamous 27 Club, a group that also includes Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, and Amy Winehouse, among others who passed away at the same age. Janis's own final day is a heartbreak for those close to her. She's scheduled to record the vocals for Buried Alive in the Blues, a track meant to appear on Pearl. When she doesn't show up at the recording studio, friends grow alarmed. She's discovered later, dead in her hotel room, the victim of an apparent heroin overdose. When the album Pearl is released posthumously in 1971, it soars in the charts. Me and Bobby McGee, written by Chris Christopherson and Fred Foster, becomes a major hit. Chillingly, just 2 days before her death, Janis had updated her will, ensuring that her parents would receive a significant portion of her estate and that her siblings would also be provided for. Notably, she earmarked $2,500, equivalent to substantially more today, for her friends to throw a party in her honor. She specifically wanted 200 guests at her favorite pub, making sure they could grieve, reminisce, and get blasted together after she was gone. That request captures her spirit, simultaneously celebratory, irreverent, and touched by a quiet awareness of her own mortality. Her final exit from the world though heartbreaking, cements her legendary status. People reflect on the irony. A doctor had once warned her she wouldn't see 24 if she continued abusing substances. And though she proved that prediction wrong for a few more years, she ultimately succumbed at 27. In the aftermath, fans and critics alike wonder what might have been had she lived longer. Would she have delved deeper into blues or ventured into jazz? Might she have found stability, embarked on new collaborations, or traveled to discover other global sounds? Janis's ashes are famously scattered from a plane into the Pacific Ocean near the Golden Gate Bridge, a fitting final tribute to a woman whose restless spirit had always gravitated to the West Coast. A sense of sorrow settles over the music community. Her passing, coming so soon after Jimi Hendrix's, contributes to an air of doom that lingers around the era's biggest stars. In subsequent years, Jim Morrison also dies, joining their ill-fated number. The 27 Club becomes a kind of macabre footnote in rock history, haunting fans with the notion that perhaps the brightest flames burn out too quickly. Like many gifted artists, Janis carried childhood trauma that never fully healed. The humiliation she endured in Port Arthur and then at UT Austin shaped a lifetime of self-esteem issues. She thought leaving Texas would solve the problem, but inner demons don't vanish just because you change location. Instead, she built a protective shell of flamboyance, humor, and raucous living. She cultivated a rebellious image, drinker of Southern comfort, driver of a psychedelic Porsche, queen of the 1960s Haight-Ashbury scene. Yet underneath that persona, a sensitive soul was quietly nursing old wounds. Her classmates calling her ugliest man on campus is especially painful in hindsight, considering how many revered her beauty and vitality once she was on the national stage. Perhaps part of her was perpetually trying to prove those bullies wrong. By championing integration back when she was a high school student, she also demonstrated courage in the face of prejudice, an ethical stance that earned her scorn in a segregated Texas. Her activism, though rarely systematic or formal, manifested whenever she saw an underdog being mistreated. She reportedly aligned herself with outcasts, outliers, and anyone denied acceptance. It's unsurprising she gravitated to the blues, a genre rooted in the tribulations of marginalized communities. This empathy extends to one of her major influences, Bessie Smith. Janis admires Smith's ability to transform raw heartbreak into songs that stir the listener's core. Learning that Smith was buried in an unmarked grave in 1937 enrages Joplin. In 1970, she and Juanita Green, who'd once worked as a child for Bessie Smith, pay for a tombstone. The epitaph reads, "The greatest blues singer in the world will never stop singing," a reflection of how Janis believed legacy lived on beyond death. She felt such a kinship with the blues legend that, in her more mystical moments, she'd say she might be Smith reincarnated. Her personal relationships consistently hover on the edge of either fulfilling her or breaking her. Stories abound about her longing for Chris Christopherson, her fling with Leonard Cohen, her complicated dynamic with men who either revered her or tried to exploit her. She's equally at ease flirting with women, hooking up with strangers, or spending nights alone, all depending on her mercurial emotional state. If there's one constant, it's that heartbreak and loneliness follow her. Yet she's never entirely defeated by them in a creative sense, because she mines that pain for her music. If anything, her heartbreak makes her singing even more extraordinary. Looking at her discography, it's astounding how short her career was. Yet songs like Piece of My Heart, Ball and Chain, Me and Bobby McGee, Summertime, Cry Baby, Down on Me, and Move Over remain timeless. Each track is an exercise in vocal catharsis, especially the ragged edges of her voice that simultaneously convey despair and defiance. Contemporary audiences still discover her recordings and find themselves floored by that emotional rawness. In an era that sometimes favored polished pop, Janis breaks the mold. Her vibrato can crack at the edges, her high notes can be messy, but the authenticity is searing. The rock and roll cliché of living fast and dying young seems tailor-made for someone like Janis. The doctor's warning about not making it to 24 becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy only a few years later. While some idolize the concept of the doomed artist, in reality, it's far more complex. Janis grapples with genuine torment, fueled by the tension between her extraordinary success and her persistent insecurities. The rush of performing in front of thousands of adoring fans is inevitably followed by lonely hours in hotel rooms, haunted by the question of whether she's truly loved for herself or merely for her stage persona. It's telling that one of her final acts is adjusting her will. Perhaps on a subconscious level, she sensed that the end was looming or recognized the precariousness of her lifestyle. She made provisions for a last blowout party, a reflection of her generosity and her unwavering desire to ensure her friends could celebrate rather than wallow in grief. True to form, Janis transforms even her own departure into a communal event, a final show of camaraderie from beyond the grave. In the days after her death, newspapers run headlines lamenting the passing of yet another bright star. A sense of shock spreads through the music community. Jimi Hendrix's funeral is still fresh in people's minds, and the parallels to Janis's overdose spark debates about the culture of drugs permeating the rock scene. The question emerges, could any of them have been saved? Did the pressures of constant touring, media scrutiny, and the easy availability of illicit substances create an environment ripe for tragedy? Janis's surviving bandmates, along with her colleagues from Big Brother, express their grief and attempt to piece together the fragments of her final moments. Rumors swirl about bad batches of heroin, about who might have been her last phone call, and about the role of enablers in her life. None of these rumors can be fully verified, but they add to the mystique of her untimely end. Then there's the question fans ask again and again. What if Janis had lived? Would she have eventually shaken off her demons? Might she have collaborated with more legends or discovered a new style bridging rock, soul, and maybe even jazz? Some speculate that she might have matured into a blues matriarch, passing on her knowledge to younger singers. Others wonder if she'd have followed the path of fellow Texan Willie Nelson, forging a long and eclectic career that encompassed multiple genres. This speculation resonates because Janis was, at heart, a restless experimenter. She left Big Brother at the height of their fame to pursue new sounds. She never stayed locked in one musical approach. It's entirely possible she would have embraced the 1970s era of funk and disco elements, or maybe aligned herself with the singer-songwriter wave, creating stripped-down acoustic sets. Her capacity for reinvention, combined with her raw talent, suggests she could have thrived creatively for decades. But the root causes that led her to self-medicate, her sense of isolation, her fear of inadequacy, were never fully addressed. We see glimpses of her vulnerability in interviews, where she jokes about bawling with strangers and feeling shattered if those she loves don't reciprocate. Observers often note that Janis seemed both fiercely independent and desperately fragile. The bravado she displayed on stage was real, but so was the ache she carried inside. Thus, her drug use wasn't merely a bohemian indulgence. It was a coping mechanism for deep-seated pain. To remain sober, she would have needed a more stable support system than the chaotic rock circuit of the late 60s and early 70s usually offered. Her stance on social issues also reveals a deeper empathy. In high school, she voices strong support for racial integration, earning her cruel taunts. She resents inequality of all kinds, whether it's aimed at African Americans, the physically imperfect, or the so-called freaks of society. Though she never becomes a formal activist, her personal ethos is to reject conformity. She demonstrates compassion for anyone on the margins, likely because she spent so much time there herself. Consider the incident with the Bessie Smith gravestone. Beyond a simple tribute, it illustrates how Janis channeled her empathy into action. Smith, who died in a car accident in 1937, was widely considered one of the greatest blues singers ever, but she was buried in an unmarked grave, an indignity Janis simply couldn't accept. She took it upon herself to raise funds to correct this historical wrong. That kind of gesture reflects Janis's sense of justice and solidarity with outsiders. It also hints at the sort of philanthropic act she might have pursued if she'd lived longer. She might have used her fame to support civil rights or to mentor young female artists struggling to break into a male-dominated industry. The details around her final days add further poignancy. She was working on what would become her most critically acclaimed album, Pearl. The track Buried Alive in the Blues stands out as an eerie symbol. She never had the chance to record the vocals, leaving only an instrumental track behind. The leftover arrangement underscores the absence of her powerful voice. Fans who listen to that track often imagine what it would have sounded like had she lived another day, another week, enough time to finish the song. This unrecorded vocal becomes a haunting metaphor for Janis herself. So much raw potential abruptly cut off. Her friend and sometimes producer, Albert Grossman, tries to manage the posthumous release of Pearl. Songs like Me and Bobby McGee dominate the airwaves, ironically granting Janis a level of posthumous success even greater than what she'd experienced in her lifetime. Radio stations can't stop playing that evocative track, and critics hail Pearl as her definitive statement. Listeners new to her music feel they've missed the chance to see a real phenomenon in concert. Older fans mourn the fact that the world lost a singular talent. Across generations, people keep discovering her recorded legacy and feeling that burn of regret. What if she had stayed just a little longer? No discussion of Janis Joplin can ignore the 27 Club, that grim label attaching itself to a cluster of remarkable artists who all perished at the same age. Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Brian Jones, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse. Janis stands among them as a tragic reminder that youth, fame, and brilliance do not guarantee long life. The club is less a real institution and more a cultural symbol. It underscores how the intensity of certain lifestyles can accelerate the downfall of individuals already precariously balanced. While the media sometimes glamorizes the 27 Club mystique, fans aware of Janis's personal demons know there was nothing glamorous about the pain she experienced. It's simply that her genius burned hot and fast, overshadowing the vulnerabilities that few outside her inner circle saw firsthand. Looking back, her run-ins with the law, such as the arrest in Florida for shouting obscenities at the police, reveal her refusal to be censored. Her entire persona champions unfiltered expression, a hallmark of her era, when social norms were being challenged at every turn. That a judge eventually dropped the charges underscores how the concept of freedom of speech was being tested in the cultural battlefield of the 1960s. Public officials were not used to public figures who brazenly flouted convention. Janis wore flamboyant clothes, drank from a whiskey bottle on stage, swore openly, and wrote music that could sear the soul. She was, in many ways, a test case for how far you could push personal freedom before conservative society pushed back. That rebellious streak shows up again in the story of her smacking Jim Morrison in the head with a bottle. She's not about to let him drag her by the hair. She's had enough experiences with men trying to control her. Her entire adolescence in Texas taught her that if a man tries to physically restrain her, she's going to defend herself. This narrative might be comedic in a certain light. Two rock legends locked in a bizarre moment of drunken confrontation. But it also reveals Janis's zero-tolerance approach to aggression. She's forged that steel in the fires of bullying and humiliation. Romantically, she's also known for heartbreak. When she encounters Leonard Cohen at the Chelsea Hotel, she's been hoping to connect with Chris Christopherson, a man she admires for his songwriting and rugged aura. Instead, she ends up with Cohen for the night, and the memory lives on in his Chelsea Hotel number 2. Years later, Cohen finally admits the song is about Joplin. It depicts their encounter not as a fairy tale romance, but as two lonely souls colliding for a fleeting moment. Janis invests emotion, but heartbreak quickly follows when she realizes she's not the woman Cohen, or Chris Christopherson for that matter, is seeking. It's another blow to her precarious sense of self-worth. Her finances are also chaotic. Despite her fame, the unpredictable nature of a musician's income combined with her impulsive spending habits means she's not always flush with cash. There are times she agrees to appear on certain festival circuits or sign short-term deals purely to cover immediate expenses. The notion of a stable retirement or a carefully curated savings account likely never crosses her mind. She lives, as she puts it, for the moment. Even so, she's thoughtful enough to structure her will, ensuring that her loved ones and her posthumous party are looked after. One might wonder how such a free spirit squares with her devotion to the memory of Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues. In paying for Smith's tombstone, Janis demonstrates a deep respect for tradition, for continuity, and for the idea that those who came before deserve recognition. It's a rare instance where she not only honors her musical inspiration, but also physically invests in preserving a piece of cultural history. Even there, she chooses to do so in the most direct, unwavering manner. If something is wrong, in this case, the lack of a proper grave marker, she'll fix it. After her death, various tributes surface. Fellow musicians speak of her generosity, her comedic streak, and her unwavering authenticity. Fans are left with bootleg recordings, vivid memories of her live sets, and the truncated discography that hints at what else she might have achieved. Certain posthumous releases compile her raw demos, offering glimpses of a side to her that's more reflective, less frantic. These leftover tapes become precious documents for devotees trying to piece together the puzzle of her artistry. Some note that her earliest folk recordings sound almost shy compared to the volcanic blues singer she became. It's a testament to her evolution. Her family, while distraught, receives the royalties she has designated for them in the will. Over time, Janis's siblings reflect on how different her path has been from the expectations of a typical Port Arthur upbringing. Yet they also acknowledge that she carved out a legacy as a major figure in rock history, something unimaginable to those who only saw her as a troubled, unconventional girl from a small Texas town. And that legacy doesn't fade. Decades later, rock historians write volumes on Janis Joplin as a pioneer, especially among women in rock. Before her, it wasn't common for a female vocalist to command the stage with the same raw intensity as the era's male icons. She opens doors for others, proving that a woman can headline festivals, front bands, and belt out lyrics loaded with heartbreak and sexuality. Artists like Stevie Nicks, Ann Wilson, and so many future generations of female rockers cite her as an influence. Moreover, her presence at events like Monterey Pop and Woodstock links her to defining cultural moments. She's part of that wave of 1960s musicians who truly believe music can change the world. Whether or not that belief is naive, Janis invests herself fully in the dream of liberation, equality, and free expression. Her life story, spanning from small-town Texas to the apex of psychedelic rock, mirrors the broader cultural upheaval of the 1960s. She becomes a symbol of possibility and of tragedy in equal measure. Sometimes people focus on the drama, her arrests, her flamboyant fur coat from Southern Comfort, her lethal addictions. But Janis's real gift is the emotional resonance she carries in her voice. Listeners still shiver at her recording of Cry Baby or Piece of My Heart, recognizing the sincerity of her raw delivery. There's no filter between her emotions and the microphone. Critics note that many singers try to emulate that authenticity but end up sounding contrived. With Janis, it's entirely genuine. She physically can't hold back. Maybe that's why she needed the Southern Comfort, to steady herself before baring her soul. She also becomes a prime example of how fame can't solve deeper emotional scars. The ugliest man on campus label might sound like a bizarre relic from a cruel era, yet to Janis, it's a lifelong wound. The men who ridiculed her then morph into the men who idolize her later, but she can't fully shed that internal sense of worthlessness. The adoration of millions can't erase the memory of scorn from her school days. It's a cautionary tale about how bullying and exclusion can shape a person's trajectory long after the immediate torment has ended. To truly understand Janis, you have to see her complexities. The extroverted rock star who never learned to manage her insecurities. The woman championing freedom of expression who was at times heartbreakingly vulnerable. The disheveled figure half lost in substance abuse who could still deliver a show-stopping performance. Her contradictions reflect the era's turbulence. The 1960s were about liberation, but also about pushing boundaries that sometimes led to destruction. Janis exemplifies both the era's potential and its pitfalls. Reflecting on what might have happened had she lived, we can only speculate. Perhaps she would have ended up collaborating with soul or gospel legends, blending her blues rasp with other musical traditions. Maybe she would have sought to create a safer environment for the next wave of female performers. She might have also grown tired of the mainstream music industry and retreated into smaller clubs to keep the music pure. There's a chance she could have found a path to sobriety, harnessing her experiences to help others. In an alternate reality, Janis Joplin might still be playing festivals into her 70s, telling stories of the Summer of Love, Monterey, and Woodstock, all while championing new artists. Yet the real Janis departed this life on October 4th, 1970. She left behind an estate that mostly went to her parents, siblings, and that fabled $2,500 for a party. Some 200 friends reportedly gathered to honor her final request, celebrating her life with the same abandon she exhibited on stage. It's almost as if she wanted her memory to spark joy, not sorrow, in those she cared about. Though we speak of her in the past tense, her influence on music remains present. Her recordings and on-stage footage keep finding new audiences, entranced by a voice that roars with longing. She is name-checked in countless documentaries about the era, credited with paving the way for female rock vocalists. Historians emphasize that her defiance of social norms, whether it involved cursing at police, wearing eccentric outfits, or championing social justice issues, helped legitimize the unconventional spirit of the 1960s. In the final tally, Janis Joplin is more than her tragedies or controversies. She's a testament to how an outcast girl from a small southern town can reshape the musical landscape through raw talent and sheer audacity. She's living proof that even crippling insecurity can coexist with mesmerizing artistry. Her life is a collage of whiskey bottles, swirling paint jobs on a Porsche, arrests for obscene language, heartfelt tributes to blues legends, and nights spent searching for love she seldom found. And yes, her story ends too soon, a cautionary reminder of how easily the line between creative brilliance and self-destruction can blur. Yet despite it all, her recordings endure. The memory of her voice stands as evidence that heartbreak can fuel transcendent art, and that even in the face of adversity, a person can create something that resonates across generations. Her early defenders say, Janis just felt everything more intensely, and that's clear when you listen to the primal shout at the climax of Piece of My Heart. It's also clear in the quieter moments, like the bittersweet lines in Me and Bobby McGee, where she makes you believe every lyric is written in her own blood. In the end, Janis Joplin's life invites us to imagine alternative paths, while also acknowledging the truths of the one she walked. She soared to extraordinary artistic heights, yet she never escaped the ache of her past. Whether we idolize her or lament her choices, we can't deny that she left an indelible mark on music history. Today, her name stands alongside the greats, Hendrix, Morrison, Jagger, and others who defined an era. You can't talk about the 1960s without mentioning that explosive, raw, blues-drenched woman from Port Arthur. Maybe the only fitting conclusion is to say that if we traded all our tomorrows for just one of her yesterdays, we'd step into that swirl of color, music, heartbreak, and ecstasy that defined Janis Joplin. Her story remains as compelling as ever, one part warning, one part inspiration, and all heart. Her soul may have burned out too soon, but her songs and the emotions they carry refuse to be buried. Decades later, they still ring out like a defiant cry, echoing across the generations, reminding us of the potent blend of courage and fragility that was and will always be Janis Joplin.